Okay, hi Amina, Ed, Guled and team. So let's see if this works. When my daughter were young, I was just doing this to do a time lapse of their drawing, but the first time I do it for a fishbone or Ishikawa. Anyway, let's see how this works and whether it can help to give an idea about the facilitation for the fishbone exercise. So what I will do here, as you see, there is a white piece of paper, is a kind of a flip chart, and what I will do is kind of do a fishbone diagram breaking down problems with regard to something that I have worked in the past. Over 4 years, between 2013 and 17, I was living in Indonesia and working in a project funded by the Australian government, which was about strengthening the knowledge system in the country, essentially improving the way different types of knowledge could or can inform policy. In that program and project, there was also an area of work which concerned and focused on universities, but it was broader than that. The knowledge system is defined by actors who produce evidence. These are definitely universities, but also think tank, NGOs, and also unit within ministry and government like policy analysts, etc. There are then actors who demand evidence, usually government officials in the bureaucracy. There are then actors who can be called as intermediaries, where sometimes because of their influence, networks, etc., are able to link the researchers or knowledge producer in a broad sense and the government staff and public servants. And then there is, around all of these actors, there are a set of regulations, legislations that kind of enable or maybe create a bit of a problem sometimes in linking knowledge producer with knowledge user. So this is just a bit of a background, and what I will do here is a bit to walk through a fishbone exercise, which is about trying to unpack the problem and then identify the areas where the project could start, because there was some opportunities, entry point or space for change. So there is a flip chart, and the question is what is the problem that we are going to try to address. Let me focus in a little bit. I mean, you see the feet of the tripod, but I think it's no problem. So what is the problem? At this stage, the people in the group start to talk and discuss. Of course, in the sector like in knowledge sector, or even in a sector like higher education and research, there is many problems, etc. What we are looking here for, the main problem, is a problem that local stakeholders, local actors, including government, but also researchers, universities, etc., or in the knowledge sector also NGOs and think tanks, they really want to solve. So it's a kind of, a problem that which time has arrived to kind of address it. At the same time, it's such a large problem, that in itself you cannot address it. You have to break it down, hence the exercise that we are doing. But you need to have a starting point. Another important element of this is that the problem has to somehow it can be described or quantified with some numbers, with some figures, so something that makes it tangible. So in the case of Indonesia, after a bit of a discussion in the groups, that we had the problem that was identified is the following. The government of Indonesia relies a lot on international technical assistance, meaning projects, programs, etc., for getting the evidence, the data, the information, the research that then is used to inform policies, or also public policy, but also programming. Now, this reality, this fact, undermines the development of an Indonesian, so a national knowledge sector, which is actually set up to produce good quality and timely evidence and research for policymakers. How do we know that this is an important problem? What are some indicators or data that shows that this is a problem? First of all, the majority of investment, and the figure can be given there, comes from donors to fund research, donors who have projects and programs with several ministries as counterpart and therefore fund that type of work. The investment of the government of Indonesia in research, particularly as a percentage of GDP, is very, very limited, and there are data and statistics that allow to compare this with neighboring countries. So Philippines has a higher percentage of government investment and resources that goes in research and development, broadly speaking, as a percentage of GDP. Vietnam much higher than Indonesia, Thailand even more so. The country who were below Indonesia with this statistic of research and development as a percentage of GDP were Laos and Cambodia, which are also kind of in the lower tier of income and categories in terms of GDP per capita. Another indicator that you have here at the bottom is that there is Indonesian universities are actually very low in terms of ranking in international ranking, regional Southeast Asia or Asia, as well as more global. So they are not emerging as institutions organizations that produce high quality research and that can increase their ranking. I remember now, without writing, that also think tanks, and there are various rankings there. There was only one Indonesia think tank that are actually within the top 500 or something like this think tank in the world. So also think tanks don't seem to produce the research, and so they would, or the quality they would allow them to increase their standing in some of those rankings. So this was the problem. Now the next step is, okay, so this, the fact that the government of Indonesia relies on international TA to produce evidence which undermine the knowledge sector per se is not a problem that you can tackle. So you need to break it down with its contributory problems. And there are two ways the exercise here can go. One is, just very briefly, that there is a quick brainstorming of different type of problems, like this. University prioritize teaching versus doing research. There are not many think tanks in Indonesia compared to the size of the economy and etc. The research or being a researcher is not a valued career. Government investment in research is very low compared to similar countries, meaning at the same GDP per capita level. There could be a kind of brainstorming and then a categorization, so you could then cluster the various post-it that come out in different categories, or like this is more what we did when we were doing this exercise. We tried to identify main categories and started to draw our fishbone. So let's see how I can do here. Because at the end of the day, this is what needs to be filled. Let me see. And we identified 5 main branches. One, we call it knowledge production. Let me see if you can see it. No, you cannot. It's here. So knowledge production. And under knowledge production, then we had a discussion which was about, under knowledge production, problems related to knowledge production, what are they, which contribute to this main problem. As I said earlier, universities prioritize teaching instead of doing research, so it matters more how many courses you teach rather than what research you produce. In terms of knowledge production, there are also not many think tanks compared to the size of the economy. And as I said earlier, being a researcher is not a valued career. A second area of problem that was identified then was about funders. And by funders, I mean international donor funding projects. And it was an interesting part of this discussion because it was quite surprising, but very much linked to the problem of government of Indonesia relying on international TA. And actually it was about, development projects, of which in Indonesia there are many, even so they are really a tiny part of the budget of the government, given that the economy is so huge. But development projects actually undermine the development of the national knowledge system, because projects are often designed to actually inform policy reform directly, and not to kind of look at the weaknesses maybe in the knowledge sector or the knowledge system and try to address those. And the success of project depends on the policy reform that they can say they have contributed to or even generated. So projects therefore generate a lot of the evidence that is required on economic, social policies, educations, etc. And then the discussion in the team was also about the fact that also contributing to the weakness in the knowledge sector, projects or programs were also in some cases directly writing legislation or regulation and maybe informing that work with evidence, but everything was part of this very confined and limited in time space that the project is. So there was therefore not a contribution to develop the national capacities of and capabilities of the knowledge system. Now, of course, the project were hiring a lot of experts and consultants, Indonesian, local, etc. So that is all expertise that exists in the country, but is for supporting and kind of working for project and for the goal and objective of the project, not so much about strengthening the knowledge system, and that was kind of interpreted as a weakness. The other another area that we had identified was about this actors group, which were knowledge intermediaries. So we said earlier there is knowledge production, knowledge demand, and sometimes in between there is knowledge intermediation, which is an important element of the knowledge system. And what in the team we found out there were problems or contributory problems related to the fact that advocacy NGOs, who are often quite have a strong role in this intermediation, in kind of advocating for change while not being directly researchers themselves. But the perception in the team when we were doing this discussion is that these advocacy NGOs do not invest enough in evidence. So they don't tend, or they don't have strong capabilities or strategy and plans to actually invest in evidence to support their advocacy message or change kind of message. Advocacy NGOs therefore also were not kind of very good in terms of capacity and skills in using evidence well. Another actor that was identified were the media, where there were of course different quality level of media, national newspapers, etc., some better than others, and also radio, TV, and social medias, etc. But knowledge producer or intermediary that belong to this wider group of media, in some cases were kind of either not very strong in using evidence to back up arguments, and that was considered as an area of weakness in the knowledge sector. The fourth area that was identified was around, as I said, policies and regulation that govern the actors producing knowledge, demanding, or maybe working on intermediation. And the policy and regulation problems were really about the government of Indonesia investing little resources, meaning budget in the national budget, yearly and 5 years plan. The investment in research was very low compared to countries with similar middle income level, and therefore that showed that there was an under appreciation of what research, especially research-based knowledge, can do in terms of informing the social economic development of the country. There were also, and something that we mentioned in the production above, also there are regulations that were actually undermining the production of good quality knowledge system, in the sense that the regulation that existed up until 5 years ago were kind of favoring teaching, as I said earlier, in terms of career progression, the number of courses, the number of students, but not so much research and publication. So essentially there are also regulations that don't value or consider the quality of research and publication, and only to some extent the quantity of publication. And a lot of academic publication in Indonesia is non-peer reviewed. But peer-reviewed research publications don't really matter very much in terms of career progression. Hence, there is no incentive to actually invest time in it. Another problem related to policies or legislations and regulation, I think is more correct, was related to the fact that the government, meaning ministries, couldn't kind of contract directly NGO/think tank to actually undertake research and inform them with some data and analysis. This was prevented by law. The reason for this goes back to the Suharto regime time, where of course civil society was kind of kept into check, and dissent was not very much allowed. But that regulation has not changed for 25 plus years, and still prevented ministry to contract NGO as organization, which undermined their possibility to develop as organization by charging overheads, etc. And what they were actually doing was to hire individual consultants, sometimes from think tanks and NGOs, but as individuals, which again creates problem in terms of organizational development. Another regulatory problem was, or legislative problem, is that ministries, when they have to develop the yearly budget, they really stick it to 12 months, and all the deliverables from project, programs, procurement, etc. have to fall within those 12 months and have to be fixed. So if Ministry of Planning on, education and social security requires 2 reports and studies during the year, and contracts, university they could contract, but they don't do it very often. The deliverable have to be 2 reports, have to be delivered within the 12 months. They cannot go over the 12 months. If the university or whoever is contracted comes back and says, we could actually with the same budget produce 3 reports and a policy or 2 reports and a policy brief and events, if that was not in the original plan and contract, it cannot be changed. So there is very little flexibility. The last area that we were looking at was the actors that are demanding evidence or demand for evidence, and there were also their kind of problem that we kind of identified, such as ministries have very limited or no budget for doing research, which has come up also from other areas, and that's no problem, of course. Discussion, debate, contestation about evidence is very limited, is very limited, meaning that the data analysis comes from ministries sometimes, or often is not the same that can come on the same subject and topic from think tank and other actors, but the space to discuss different results of the analysis was not there, and it's partly cultural, partly about resources, partly about this avoidance of discussions and, in a sense, debate that could also be a bit sensitive. I can't read my handwriting. It's about this. So ministries also, identifying evidence needs requires sometimes a mapping of the gap in the knowledge that as a ministry or units within ministry exist, and therefore you're able then to identify some areas that of research and analysis that can be procured from external organization or maybe even done internally. But this exercise of mapping the evidence gaps or evidence needs is something that was not done usually by the ministry we were involved. They were Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Bureaucratic Reform, to some extent Ministry of Education, and the coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs, which is a bit of a portfolio ministry. So you see, this kind of post-it, they come out of discussions. There are two ways. As I said earlier, first just brainstorm everything and then categorize, refine and map the branches of the fishbone, or have the groups that kind of identify the main areas from this about this main problem in its contributory problem. And there is no best exact fishbone or Ishikawa. It can come out in different ways. What I have seen in different exercises that I've done about this is that it takes a little bit time to people to identify and discuss and agree about the main problem and working maybe on the first branch, but once this happens it actually goes very fast. And I stop here, and the next step is to identify or prioritize a space for change. Okay, we are back. So step 2, or I guess step 3. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So once the fishbone is kind of populated and the group has kind of mapped out contributory problems to this main problem, they're happy also with the kind of categories, which of course they can change during the discussion and be rearranged, or contributory problem can be moved from one area to another. I mean, this is up to the group to see how they feel about that. As you see, there is a number of problems here, and some of these contributory problems are more or less tractable than others. So there are some problems here, or contributory problems, that are easy to address, meaning the conditions maybe are more suited to do that, and other that will require longer time to actually test solution, find solution that work, or change also the political economy and the context before finding solutions. So some of these problems can be kind of addressed relatively quickly with the projects, the program, or activities within a project, a program. Other may require longer time. So for example, research is not a valued career choice. Is a mix of cultural perception by people, etc., etc. So it's actually, I would say, that a problem like this should be actually broken down even more. But even by having that sense that this is as such is difficult to tackle, and you need to better understand what are the contributory problems to this contributory problem, you see that it means already that it's kind of difficult to find or test solution, because how can you test to make the research a more valued career? Valued career are careers that gives job security, that allow to support and sustain families, provide also a profile in the society, and also bring good income. So how do you change it? So you see, this is a bit more complicated. There are not many think tanks in Indonesia compared to the size of the economy, etc. So one solution would be to establish new one or improve the one that already exists. And this is something you could start to think about doing something right right now. So how to make this choice, right, between problem that somehow it's possible to imagine a solution can be tested relatively quickly, or the conditions are there to actually do that, and other that will require more time. To do that, the methodology here is about discussing the 3 A's. The 3 A's stands for authority, acceptance, and abilities. Now, what is behind these 3 names? Authorities, or these 3 words: authorities, authority, acceptance, and ability. There are 3 criteria to make the choice and understanding what space for change or for testing solution exists. So authority is about the fact that there are individuals or institutions with authority who can actually say, yes, let's try something different. Projects are usually, they always tend to find authority from, if it is a national project, a national reform in education, from a minister, because there is this thinking that, if the authority comes from the top in kind of hierarchical system, it's possible then to get things moving. So if things are signed off from the top, for example, a minister or a local government, governor, etc., it's possible to kind of get things moving, and the authority trickles down, and therefore the project has space, or the program or the initiative has a space for trying out things. But it's often what projects and program in a traditional sense try to do is only to get this authority, and this authority, there is a bit of illusion that it will trickle down into the system and allow then the project to implement activities. Now, in the 4 years I was in the project in Indonesia, which is not a very long period of time, at the Ministry of Planning, which was our counterpart, there have been 3, if I remember correctly, or 4 ministers in 4 years, also because there was a national election in between. So as you see, if you build or bet everything on getting the authority to try to solve some of these problems, on convincing the minister that this is worthwhile project, and you need to get the sign off that you need, and that person changes 3-4 times in a space of 4 years, every time you have to restart the conversation, because there is new people coming in. So authority is necessary but not sufficient in itself. Therefore, this the discussion here should include 2 other A's, which is acceptance and ability. So the acceptance is about a middle level civil servants with whom solutions are actually tested on a day-to-day basis, as something that really matters to try out things. So acceptance by this middle level civil servants is important, because they are the one who test solution, and usually they're also the one that because of election changes at the top, i.e. the authority, they actually don't change. The bureaucracy stays kind of the same. I mean, in Indonesia there are changes and movement and shifts in the composition of the bureaucracy, and people are move around between department and ministry, but there is not as frequent as election, particularly at the medium level. Top senior bureaucrat, of course, they change with minister, but not this medium level. They are the one who can, you need acceptance about the problems that have been discussed. You need acceptance about the possibility to try out solution, and also their acceptance of continue to working in a different way. And it's something a bit not very much tangible, but important to complement the authority, which in itself is not sufficient. Once authority, depending on the degree of authority and acceptance, the third A that is suggested here is the one that refers to ability. So projects, a program, an experiment, a test, an initiative requires the ability to actually try out things. And the ability is given by either financial resources, i.e. the budget that the project brings, or the budget that the project and the partners in the country bring, technical knowledge that is required to address some of this problem, organizational, administrative capacity, capability, etc. So the ability is given by those elements, two of which I just mentioned are kind of ability, but also technical knowledge, resources, possibility to bring in expertise, or to expose and to, for example, study visit some of the actors involved here to ways of doing things in the knowledge sector in other countries. So that ability matters. So it's when the authority is there, the acceptance is there, the ability is there, that is possible to try out something relatively quickly. If the authority, or some of this, like authority, acceptance, and ability, are not there before trying out solution and testing solution, the project has to invest time in building either one of them, authority, acceptance, or ability. Therefore, once you have built that, it's possible then you are in a better space or better place to actually try solutions. So I will show you in a couple of example here how we went about identifying through the triple A's, authority, acceptance, and ability, the space for change and where we could try out things. Okay, last step. So how to translate the triple A, authority, acceptance, and ability in practice. And I'll kind of show you on about 5 of this problem how things were done. Let me start, but before I do, let me start from kind of looking, broadly at this map, an area that in the end we didn't even address, or we didn't even start the AAA discussion. So this area of problem related to funders, and particularly how programs often undermine the development of a knowledge system, of a national knowledge system, because they either generate the evidence, influence directly policy reforms, or even write legislation in some cases. Now, these are projects funded by development partners, and Australian government in Indonesia is, after the World Bank, I think the biggest funder, particularly in governance. Maybe JICA is bigger, or China, of course, on infrastructure, but let's say governance. And we were funded by the Australian government. They were funding also other programs in education, governance, health, etc., which were doing these things, as well as other donors, Germany, Switzerland. DFID is actually pretty small in Indonesia, the World Bank itself. But as a project funded by development partner, we couldn't go to other projects and say, stop generating evidence, find other ways, or find other ways to generate evidence. Don't try to influence reform directly by using knowledge system, and so on. So this was from the beginning, from the get-go, an area that we couldn't work. Of course, the program was having, particularly through the team leader, regular discussion with all the other programs funded by Australia as well as other funders, and of course sharing the model that we were trying out, the problem that we were trying to solve, the activities and everything, and kind of advocating for the support of a national knowledge system. But we couldn't really do work here, so this area was not considered. Knowledge production was considered a little bit as an easier area or entry point, particularly on think tanks, because in terms of the AAA, the authority, the ability, and the kind of the authority, the acceptance, and the abilities related to think tanks, they were all quite good and quite linked to each other, meaning the individuals who run think tanks, the existing think tanks, of course not the one that don't exist, want to get support and need also the financial technical assistance support to improve their work. There is an acceptance by staff, by this organization, to actually do that, and project and program have the ability to provide funding and technical assistance. So, but the decision or the solution that we try to test, instead of creating new think tanks, particularly using donor funding was to actually identify 15 existing think tanks, some of which were established through projects and programs, and continue to develop their capacity by identifying their needs and use grants to fund their development. And this could start straight away because the A's were the three A's were kind of quite close with each other. In terms of policies and regulation, there was also this a similar discussion, and by looking at the 4 contributory problems here, Minister of Planning can kind of procure things only, or plan procurement of research and other things only over 12 months. The government cannot contract NGOs or think tank to do research. Career progression university is not determined by the quality of research and publication, and government of Indonesia research investment in research is low compared to other countries. We were discussing here also the AAA, and overall I think in this area there was authority in the sense and interest by Ministry, particularly of Education, Research and Technology, to try to change things. There was not so much, but to different degrees. For example, Minister of Planning can only, and other ministers as well, can only kind of procure a plan over and budget over a 12 months period, and everything is very rigid. So the Minister of Planning, in terms of authority, actually had an interest to change that. So there was a good authority. But the Minister of Planning was not the only one. They are kind of line manager, or at least below them there is the procurement kind of agency, which is the one responsible for this procurement guideline. The acceptance there was to change things, so and so, not very big. In terms of ability, so technical assistance to change procurement regulations and allow more flexibility in the yearly planning and budgeting, etc., I think the project was quite good. So this A was okay. But you see, the acceptance, particularly from the procurement agency, was not so. So before trying regulatory reforms on procurement and make the planning and procurement and budgeting over 12 months more flexible, there was a need to actually build this acceptance by the procurement agency. So what this means, that the solution to this was, of course, to revise the procurement regulation, make it more flexible. But before trying out things, there was, in a sense, work required to bring on board with this idea, testing, etc., the procurement agency. So the acceptance by the procurement agencies. And the first couple of years of the projects were kind of really about expanding this A and bring it closer to the other. And after 4.5 years, I think, of the project, because it is now in the second phase, a new regulation was passed, meaning that the 3 A's came together, and it was possible to do that. But it required work first to bring them on board. Discussion, working group, discussion, meetings, etc. Before actually this could be tried out. Revision of the text of the procurement regulation, acceptance by them, authorities was kind of always there. So another area with regard to the contributory problems, policies, regulation, or legislation and regulation where we try out things was about the limited investment by the government of Indonesia in funding research compared to other countries. Now, there was acceptance by certain actors to try to do this. to change this. These were, coalitions of think tank and NGOs, so research type of based organization. Also, kind of some university, particularly senior departments head from the University of Indonesia, they wanted to change that. They were the one that in the end would deal with the day-to-day kind of management of funding, doing research, etc. So there was an acceptance by non-government, meaning non-ministry actors to try to do things, and they were the first group that actually in the end came together. There was ability by the project to bring different actors together, and through the budget that we had to organize a group discussion, fund some studies, some regulatory assessment, etc. There was little authority and to some extent also acceptance by Ministry of Research, Science and Technology to actually do something about it. Is a political area. They didn't see this as being a problem. Yes, they want more funding, but again, the incentive for the staff within universities actually to do teaching rather than do research. So, not so much interest in the ministries for some reason. So, what that means was that, of course, the possible solution here was to test a new research fund or modality that could help to fund research activities by university or others over more than just 12 months and be kind of broad in scope. And to test these funds, there was a need to bring together actors from government, universities, academy, National Academy of Science, etc. But before doing that, or as part of that process, there was a need to increase this authority / acceptance, particularly by the Ministry of Science and Technology, and kind of work through, again, meeting, discussion, working group, presentation of data, evidence about Indonesia compared to other countries, etc., to build this authority, bring it close to acceptance and ability which actually were there, particularly the acceptance by other actors, non-ministry, and then therefore test a research fund, which in the end was tested. There was an allocation by the government of $10 million US to fund multi-year research on health and social development initially as a trial. Research could be conducted by think tanks as well as universities and in collaboration especially, and over up to 3 years. But again, that process, particularly because of the need to build these authorities, a little bit the acceptance also of the ministry took over 3 years. But the initial assessment was that before testing this, there was a need to work and build that coalition. The last example that I want to give here was about this area of problem or contributory problem on demand for evidence. And by discussing this, one of the contributory problems that were discussed was about this discussion on evidence is very limited. So again, what is the problem here? The problem is that data, evidence generated by ministry maybe to justify their plans and programs is not contested, is not discussed in open forum very often, and there is limited contribution maybe by similar evidence, data analysis from other organizations, so that the contestation process, validates certain findings and certain data and evidence, and therefore it increases the quality of the influence and the policies and the programs that can emerge from it. Now, this is of course a political area, because some of the knowledge producers are not, are not government, they are NGOs. They may be also opposed to policies and program in government, and there is always that government, not government tension. So in terms of authority here, to do something there, not very much, so there was not a strong mandate. In terms of acceptance, particularly by the bureaucracy, to have that dialogue or confrontation, depending on how you see, was not very much. The ability of the program to work in this area, again, technical assistance, finance, budget, to also fund some research that would allow debate and discussion, bring people together, was definitely there. But what the first 3 years of the program require before thinking about a solution, or maybe to move towards a solution to this limited discussion, was to build this authority and acceptance, particularly by not only by government or ministerial actors, but also by non-government. So it was like, the habit of coming into a room, discuss the data, discuss the evidence, and be open also to criticism. Culturally also was not very strong, and it required several rounds of people coming together to find the right formula to do that. And the right formula is essentially people getting to know each other. When that is there, and researchers, staff from ministries, and senior or less senior came together several times, they started to get to know each other. They had formal and informal discussion, and they increased the acceptance and the authority over time, so that at some point it was possible to test what we called knowledge communities, which were essentially, I would say, working group around specific social development policy area or policy change area that Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Bureaucratic Reform was thinking, and where the discussion was happening with researchers, experts, contributing with their knowledge directly or by producing some of the research by the program. But again, it was about first building this too. Now, we have 4 examples here of discussion with AAA, and then the first one, where the 3 A's were kind of, close together, quite strong, was possible to start work immediately. The other areas we could start work, but they require some work on building those ability, in this case authority, and here authorities, and in this case acceptance, in this case authority, and in this case both authority and acceptance. It doesn't mean that you cannot start, but the results actually come a bit later. The work on building capacity started immediately, and there were signs of changes in practice, management of research in think tank. After 2 years into the program, revision of the regulation on procurement took 4 years. The research funds was established after 5 years, and the testing and the establishment of knowledge community took about 3 years. But by having this mapped out in this way, it's possible to identify where, and suggest, in our case, to see the areas or problems that can be solved as an initial testing, or with initial testing and experimentation, and others were important considered important by the participant, but at the same time which require to think more carefully about how to engage the right actors and so on, but still important. But there is a bit of a prioritization, as you can see here. The last point I want to share with you is about how to organize at the workshop, in our case the groups. And I was thinking yesterday about the participants, and in some cases it's interesting to have this exercise by grouping the participants depending on what area, let's say, of the society or government they come. So if in the room there are NGOs, think tank, there are universities, people, there are government staff, it would be interesting to have them to work together on the problem analysis, breaking down, prioritization, and then compare whether there are differences in terms of the main problem identified by them and the contributory problem. That's one way. The other way is actually to mix the group together so that you have some of this discussion and contestation already. So there is possibility to have, for example, a random division of people. You give number 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know how many groups, but then 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. They come together and they discuss. And that's also very productive in the sense that it allows representative maybe from the government, from universities and think tank to discuss things and also come together with this. There are plus and both are a good way to go, right? If people belong to the same group, we can compare the analysis they can come up with, or we can do the same by them mixing together. Now that I'm talking about this, I would favor a bit more of a random and mixed type of groups because of the discussion and debate that can emerge, and then see whether there are similarities in the terms of the main problem and the contributory problem that emerge from the discussion. So I hope that this was useful. I think it's a bit long, but it's more to show you a bit how the different steps of this exercise. The presentation at the workshop should take very little, and I'm now going to very little, because there is no one way to do these things. The perfect fishbone does not exist, and it's really about the group having the time and the space to come together, work in this way, and then share in the plenary. In some exercises that I've done like this, people came up with many problems in a short time. In some, there were only very few problems, and that is all fine. We are exploring problems through our interviews and the desk review. So in a sense, this is an additional piece of information, but we have already information on the problems. I will now put this together in the computer, and I think I upload it in YouTube and share the link with you, and then I think I have 3-4 slides which explain a bit this exercise, and I have to dig a bit into my computer, and I hope to share that as well. The last thing that I still owe you is a bit of a key points from the interviews that have been recorded on paper, so far, and that is coming. So I hope this was useful, and maybe I do more of this, I don't know. Bye.